Hey everyone, tonight we begin with a journey back to a world where your morning alarm wasn't your phone buzzing on the nightstand, but the desperate lowing of cattle that hadn't been milked since yesterday evening, where your to-do list wasn't organized in a neat app, but carved into your very survival, and where a single mistake could mean the difference between your family eating this winter or watching your children's ribs show through their skin by February. We're talking about medieval farm life, and I promise you, it's nothing like the romanticized versions you've seen in movies or read about in fantasy novels. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: you wake up in what can generously be called a house, though it's really more like a wooden box with a thatched roof that leaks in 17 different places. There's no glass in the windows because glass is for rich people, so you've got wooden shutters that you can either keep closed and suffocate in darkness, or open and let in every bug, bird and blast of cold air that feels like breathing through wet wool. The floor isn't hardwood or even dirt that's been properly packed down. It's just whatever happened to be on the ground when your great-grandfather decided this was a good spot to build, mixed with decades of spilled food, animal droppings, and the occasional human accident, because chamber pots are expensive and the outdoor privy is a long, cold walk in the middle of January. Your bed isn't a bed in any sense you'd recognize. It's a wooden platform covered with straw that you share with your spouse, your children, and quite possibly your parents if they're still alive. Plus whatever chickens decided to wander inside for warmth. The straw hasn't been changed in months, because fresh straw is precious, and you'll use every piece of it for the animals first, because the animals are what keep you alive. So you're sleeping on what is essentially a pile of decomposing grass, mixed with feathers, bits of food, and things you don't want to think about too hard. The smell alone would send most modern people running for the nearest hotel, but you've been breathing it every night for so long that you don't even notice it anymore. But here's the thing that would break most modern people immediately. You can't just lie there for a few more minutes, scrolling through your phone. The moment consciousness hits your brain, you're already late, because every single thing you need to stay alive today has to be done by your hands, and there are never enough hours in the day to do it all. The cattle are already making noise, which means their udders are painfully full, and if you don't milk them soon, they'll get infected and die, and then you'll have no milk, no cheese, no butter, and no cattle to sell when times get desperate. So you roll off your pile of straw, and your back immediately reminds you that you're 35 years old, but your spine feels like it's 90, because you've been hauling water and lifting heavy things and bending over crops since you were old enough to walk. Your joints crack in ways that would send a modern person straight to a doctor. But doctors don't exist for people like you. There's maybe a barber surgeon in the nearest town who might be able to pull a tooth or set a bone, but he's a 3-day walk away and costs more than you make in a year. Plus, there's a decent chance he'll kill you accidentally while trying to help, because medical knowledge in the 12th century consists mostly of bloodletting, prayer, and hoping for the best. You stumble outside, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Not the clean, fresh morning air you might imagine, but the concentrated essence of everything that's been rotting, fermenting, and decomposing around your home for months. The midden heap, where you throw all your garbage, is right outside your door because where else would you put it? There's no garbage collection, no sewage system, no concept of waste management beyond throw it somewhere that isn't inside the house. So you've got food scraps, human waste, animal waste, and the remains of anything that died recently, all mixed together in a soup that would make a modern person vomit instantly. But you don't even notice it anymore, because this is just what the world smells like. Every farm smells like this. Every village smells like this. Every city smells like this. But worse. The only time you notice a bad smell is when something has gone really spectacularly wrong, like when the neighbour's pig died and he didn't find it for a week, and the stench got so bad that even people who live surrounded by manure started complaining. Now you've got to get to the animals, and the animals are not happy to see you. Medieval farm animals weren't the plump, docile creatures you see at petting zoos today. These are half-wild, mean-tempered beasts that have been bred for survival, not convenience. Your cattle are basically angry. 1,000-pound weapons with horns, and they're hungry and uncomfortable, and they will absolutely kick you in the head if you approach them wrong. You can't just walk up and start milking. You have to negotiate with each cow individually, figure out their mood, bring them some food to keep them calm, and hope they don't decide today is the day they're going to remember they don't actually like you. The milking itself is an ordeal that would destroy the hands of anyone who's spent their life typing on keyboards. You're squeezing and pulling with your full strength over and over again, and if you're not fast enough, the cow gets impatient and steps on your foot with a hoof that weighs more than you do. If you're not thorough enough, the cow gets an infection and dies. If you're not careful enough, the cow kicks over the bucket and you've just lost a day's worth of food for your family. Your hands are already cracked and bleeding from the cold and the rough work, and the repetitive squeezing motion opens up every cut and makes them deeper. And this is just the beginning of your day. You haven't even eaten yet, and you won't eat until you've taken care of every single animal, checked every single crop, repaired whatever broke yesterday, and dealt with whatever crisis has inevitably developed overnight. Maybe the chickens got into the grain storage and scattered 3 months' worth of carefully rationed food all over the ground. Maybe the neighbour's pig broke through your fence and ate your entire vegetable garden. Maybe your child woke up with a fever and you have to decide whether to use your precious herbs, trying to treat it, or save them for when someone gets really sick. Because here's what people don't understand about medieval farm life. There's no margin for error, none. Every decision you make could be the difference between life and death, not just for you, but for your entire family. You can't afford to get sick, because there's no one else to do the work. You can't afford to make mistakes, because you don't have backup resources. You can't afford to relax, because the moment you stop working, things start dying. Your day revolves around a series of crises that you have to solve with nothing but your hands, your brain, and whatever tools you've managed to cobble together from wood and metal. The plough needs repair, but you don't have money for a blacksmith, so you have to figure out how to fix it yourself with materials you can find lying around. The roof is leaking, but you can't afford to hire someone to fix it, so you have to climb up there yourself and try to patch it with whatever you can find, knowing that if you fall and break a leg, your family will probably starve. And then there's the weather, which is not just an inconvenience, but a direct threat to your survival. You don't check a weather app to see if you need an umbrella. You look at the sky and try to predict whether the next 3 months will bring enough rain to keep your crops alive, but not so much rain that they rot in the ground. You watch the wind and try to figure out if it's bringing a storm that will flatten your grain right before harvest. You feel the temperature and wonder if this is the year winter comes early and kills everything before you can get it stored safely. But let's say you make it through the morning animal care without getting killed or maimed. Now you have to eat something. And this is where the reality of medieval farm life would probably break your spirit entirely. You don't have a pantry full of options. You don't have a refrigerator with leftovers. You have whatever you managed to grow, preserve, or store from the last harvest. And by this time of year, it's probably getting pretty grim. Breakfast might be a piece of bread that's so hard you have to soak it in whatever liquid you can find just to make it chewable. The bread isn't the fluffy, white stuff you're used to. It's dark, dense, and made from whatever grains you could afford, mixed with whatever else you could find to stretch it further. Acorns, if you were lucky enough to find them and had time to process them properly. Beans, if you grew them and managed to keep them from rotting. Sometimes things that aren't technically food but will keep you alive, like ground up bark or roots that taste like dirt but have some nutritional value. The liquid you're using to soften your bread probably isn't water, because water is dangerous. You know it's dangerous even though you don't understand why. You just know that people who drink water from certain sources get sick and die, so you stick to ale or wine or whatever fermented beverage you've managed to produce. Yes, you're drinking alcohol for breakfast, and so is everyone else, including the children, because it's safer than water and provides calories you desperately need. After breakfast, you head out to check on your crops, and this is where the full scope of your situation becomes clear. You're not just growing food for fun or profit. You're growing food to keep your family alive through the winter, and also to pay your taxes, and also to pay your rent to the Lord who owns the land you're working, and also to set aside seed for next year's planting. Every single plant in your field represents a calculation. How much can I eat now versus how much do I need to save? How much can I trade for things I can't make myself? How much do I need to give away to avoid having soldiers show up at my door? And your crops are constantly under attack. Insects that you can't identify and can't effectively fight are eating your plants. Diseases that you don't understand are turning your grain black and poisonous. Weeds that grow faster than anything you actually want are choking out your food. Wild animals are sneaking in at night and eating months' worth of work in a single evening. Your neighbours' animals are breaking through your fences and destroying your carefully tended plants. But the worst part is that you can't just plant more if something goes wrong. You have a limited amount of seed, and if you use it up replanting failed crops, you won't have any for next year. You have a limited amount of good soil, and if you overwork it trying to grow more food, it will stop producing entirely. You have a limited amount of time, and if you spend too much of it replanting, you won't have time to harvest what actually grows. So you walk through your fields every day, making impossible decisions. This section of grain is being eaten by insects. Do you sacrifice it to save the rest? Or do you spend precious time trying to fight the insects and risk losing everything? That vegetable garden is being choked by weeds. Do you spend a full day pulling weeds? Or do you accept that you're going to lose some of your food and use that time to work on something else that might be more important? Every single day brings new disasters that you have to solve immediately or watch your family's future disappear. The fence is broken and the neighbour's pigs are eyeing your crops. You don't have wood to fix the fence properly, so you have to steal branches from the forest, which is technically illegal and could get you in serious trouble if you're caught. But if you don't fix the fence, you'll lose your crops and then you'll starve, so you sneak into the woods and hope the Lord's men don't catch you. And speaking of the Lord's men, they show up regularly to remind you that you don't actually own anything. Not your land, not your crops, not your animals, not even your own labour. You're a tenant, which means you're basically renting your entire existence from someone who has never worked a day in his life and doesn't understand or care about the challenges you face. He wants his rent paid in grain, but he also wants his taxes paid in grain. And he also wants you to work his fields for free several days a week. And he also wants you to give him your best animals when he demands them. So you're standing in your field, looking at grain that represents your family's survival, and you have to decide how much of it you can afford to keep. Too little, and you starve. Too much, and armed men show up to take it anyway, plus extra as punishment for trying to cheat them. There's no appealing this decision, no negotiating, No explaining that you had a bad harvest or that your child is sick and needs extra food. You give them what they want, or they take everything. But let's say you manage to navigate the morning without losing your crops or getting arrested. Now it's time for the afternoon work. And this is when the physical reality of medieval farm life would absolutely destroy a modern person. You're going to spend the next 6 hours doing manual labor that would challenge a professional athlete, using tools that barely work, in conditions that would violate every safety regulation ever written. If it's harvest time, you're cutting grain with a scythe, which is basically a giant curved blade attached to a long handle. You swing this thing over and over again, cutting through thick stalks of grain while trying not to cut off your own leg. Your back is bent at an angle that would put a modern person in physical therapy. Your hands are developing blisters that turn into calluses, that turn into permanent deformities, and your arms are screaming from the repetitive motion. But you can't stop, because every hour of daylight is precious. And if you don't get the grain cut and dried before the weather changes, you lose everything. The scythe itself is a tool that would terrify any modern safety inspector. It's not balanced properly, because you made it yourself, or traded for it from someone who barely knew what they were doing. The blade is nicked and dull, because you can't afford to have it sharpened by a professional, so you try to maintain it yourself, with a whetstone that's probably doing more harm than good. The handle is rough wood that gives you splinters every time you grip it, and it's not quite the right length for your height, so every swing puts stress on joints and muscles in ways they weren't designed to handle. If it's planting time, you're walking behind a plough that's being pulled by an ox that doesn't want to go where you want it to go. The plough keeps hitting rocks and roots and getting stuck, and every time it happens, you have to stop and dig it out by hand. The ox is stronger than you, so if it decides to go in a different direction, you either go with it or get dragged. Your feet are sinking into mud that's mixed with manure, and every step is a battle against suction that's trying to pull your shoes off. And speaking of shoes, yours are probably falling apart because leather is expensive and cobblers are rare. You might be walking around in shoes that are held together with strips of cloth, or shoes that have holes that let in mud and stones and everything else you're walking through. Your feet are probably a mess of blisters, cuts and infections, but you can't stop walking because the work has to be done. If it's growing season, you're weeding, which means you're bent over for hours, pulling up plants by hand, one at a time, while the sun beats down on your back and insects swarm around your head. Your hands are covered in cuts from thorns and rough stems, your knees are screaming from the position, and your back feels like someone is driving a hot poker through your spine. But you can't stop, because every weed you leave behind is a plant that will steal nutrients from your food. The insects alone would drive a modern person insane. You don't have bug spray or screens or any way to keep them away from you. Flies are constantly landing on your face and hands, getting in your eyes and mouth, laying eggs in any cut or wound you have. Mosquitoes swarm around you in clouds, biting every piece of exposed skin until you look like you have some kind of disease. Bees and wasps are attracted to your sweat and will sting you for no reason at all. And you can't swat them away effectively because your hands are busy with work, so you just have to endure being eaten alive by insects while you try to grow food. And all of this is happening while you're hungry, because you can't afford to eat much during the day. You need to save your food for the evening meal, and even that's going to be smaller than what your body actually needs. So you're doing back-breaking physical labor while running on empty, and wondering if you'll have enough energy to make it through the day. But the work doesn't stop when the sun goes down. Now you have to deal with all the things you couldn't do during the day because you were in the fields. The animals need to be fed and watered and moved to safe areas for the night. The tools need to be cleaned and repaired, The house needs to be secured against whatever might try to get in during the night. The fire needs to be maintained, because if it goes out, you'll have to start it again from scratch, and that could take hours. And then there's the cooking, which is nothing like the romantic image of medieval life you might have in your head. You're not preparing a feast with multiple courses and fancy seasonings. You're trying to turn whatever scraps you have into something that will keep your family alive another day. You might have some grain that you can boil into a porridge that tastes like wet cardboard but provides calories. You might have some vegetables that are half rotten but still edible if you cut away the bad parts. You might have some meat, but it's probably from an animal that died of disease or old age, and it's been preserved in salt for so long that it's basically leather. The cooking is done over an open fire that fills your house with smoke, because chimneys are for rich people. So you're trying to prepare food while your eyes are watering and your lungs are burning, and everything you cook tastes like smoke anyway. You don't have proper pots or pans, so you're using whatever metal containers you can find or afford, and they're probably dented and cracked and not very good at heating evenly. The fire itself is a constant source of anxiety. You have to keep it going all the time because starting a new fire is difficult and time-consuming, but you also have to make sure it doesn't get out of control and burn down your house. You're constantly feeding it with wood that you had to cut and gather yourself, and if you run out of fuel, you're in serious trouble. In winter, the fire is the only thing keeping your family from freezing to death, but it's also using up resources you might need for other things. But here's the thing that would really break a modern person. This isn't a temporary hardship. This isn't a camping trip or a survival challenge that you can quit when it gets too hard. This is your entire life, and it's going to be your children's entire life, and their children's entire life. There's no retirement, no vacation, no sick days, no weekends. You work until you die, and you die young, and the best you can hope for is that you manage to keep your family alive long enough for them to take over the work. And the social isolation would be devastating for someone used to modern communication. You might see your neighbours occasionally, but they're dealing with their own survival crises and don't have time for socialising. You might go to church on Sundays, but that's mostly just another obligation, another place where you're reminded of your place in the social hierarchy. You might go to the market in the nearest town a few times a year, but that's a dangerous journey that takes days and costs money you don't have. The journey to town is itself a major undertaking that would challenge any modern person. You have to walk for hours or days on roads that are basically just paths worn down by previous travellers, carrying whatever goods you hope to trade. The roads are full of bandits who will rob you if they think you have anything worth taking, and they're also full of wild animals that see you as potential food. You have to sleep outdoors with no protection, except whatever weapons you can make or afford, and you have to carry enough food and water for the entire journey. When you finally reach the town, you discover that it's not much better than your farm. The streets are just as dirty and smelly as your farmyard, but concentrated into a smaller space with more people. The buildings are crowded together and poorly constructed, so fires spread quickly and disease moves from person to person like wildfire. The people you're trying to trade with are just as desperate as you are, so they'll cheat you if they can, and you have to be constantly on guard against pickpockets and con artists. Most of your human interaction is limited to your immediate family, and even that's strained by the constant pressure of survival. You can't have heart-to-heart conversations about your hopes and dreams, because everyone's hopes and dreams are the same: make it through another day, another season, another year. You can't discuss philosophy or art or literature because you can't read, and even if you could, you don't have access to books or the time to read them. Your entertainment is limited to whatever stories people can remember and tell around the fire, and even that happens rarely because people are too tired for storytelling most nights. Your music is whatever someone can sing from memory, and your art is whatever someone can carve into wood or stone during the few moments when they're not working. Your intellectual stimulation comes from trying to solve practical problems. How do I fix this tool? How do I make this crop grow better? How do I keep my family alive through the winter? But perhaps the most crushing aspect of medieval farm life is the complete lack of control you have over your own fate. In the modern world, we believe that hard work and good decisions lead to success, and that failure is usually the result of poor choices or bad luck. In medieval times, you could work as hard as humanly possible, make all the right decisions, and still watch your family starve to death because of forces completely beyond your control. A single hailstorm could destroy your entire harvest in minutes. A disease could kill all your animals overnight. A war between lords could result in armies marching through your fields, eating everything you've grown and burning what they can't carry. A new tax could take away so much of your grain that you don't have enough left to survive. A bad winter could kill you even if you did everything right during the growing season. And there's no appeal process, no insurance, no government assistance. If disaster strikes, you're on your own. Your neighbours might help if they can, but they're facing the same challenges you are, and they can't afford to sacrifice their own family's survival for yours. The church might provide some charity, but it's usually not enough to make a real difference, and it comes with strings attached that might make your situation worse in the long run. And finally, there's the constant awareness that everything you've worked for could disappear in an instant. A single bad harvest could mean starvation. A single injury could mean you can't work and your family falls apart. A single conflict between lords could mean armies marching through your fields, eating your crops and burning your house. A single disease could wipe out your animals or your family or yourself. You go to bed every night knowing that tomorrow might be the day everything falls apart, and you wake up every morning knowing that you have to work as hard as you possibly can just to have a chance of surviving another day. There's no insurance, no safety net, no government assistance. There's just you, your family, and whatever you can grow or make or trade to stay alive. The psychological toll of this existence would be unbearable for most modern people. Living with that level of uncertainty and fear every single day, never knowing if you're going to have enough food or if your children are going to survive the winter, would break down even the strongest person's mental health. And there's no therapy, no medication, no support groups. You just have to endure it and hope that somehow you'll make it through. So when people romanticize medieval farm life, they're imagining a world that never existed. They're thinking about the parts they can see in movies, the green fields, the simple pleasures, the sense of community. But they're not thinking about the hunger, the exhaustion, the fear, the pain, the constant battle against forces you can't control or understand. They're not thinking about what it would actually feel like to live in a world where your survival depends entirely on your ability to work harder than the human body was designed to work, in conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards, with no hope of anything better for yourself or your children. That's why you wouldn't last a day on a medieval farm, not because you're soft or weak, but because you're used to a world where survival is guaranteed, where problems have solutions, where help is available when you need it. You're used to a world where you can afford to make mistakes, where you can take time to rest when you're tired, where you can see a doctor when you're sick. You're used to a world where your value as a person isn't measured entirely by your ability to produce food and pay taxes. Medieval farm life would strip away every assumption you have about how the world works, every expectation you have about fairness and justice and human dignity. It would show you a world where most people live and die in circumstances that would horrify you, not because they're unlucky or because they made bad choices, but simply because that's how the world works when you don't have the technology, the social systems, and the economic structures that make modern life possible. The rooster doesn't crow at dawn on a medieval farm because roosters are a luxury you can't afford, and dawn is when rich people get up. You've been awake since what modern people would call 3 a.m., stumbling around in darkness so complete that you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face, trying to figure out what that noise was that woke you up, and whether it means something is dying, dead, or about to kill you. By the time the sun starts to think about making an appearance, you've already milked the cow, fed the pigs whatever scraps you could find, checked to make sure nothing broke through your fence during the night, and discovered that yes, something did die, and now you have to figure out whether it's safe to eat, or whether you need to bury it quickly before it makes everything else sick. Now comes the moment that would shatter every romantic notion you have about medieval farm life: breakfast. Not the hearty meal of fresh bread, eggs and milk that you see in movies, but the grim reality of trying to get enough calories into your body to survive another day of back-breaking labor, while using ingredients that would make a modern person call the health department. Let's start with what you're not eating. You're not eating eggs, because eggs are valuable and chickens don't lay consistently. And when they do lay, you need to save the eggs to trade for things you can't make yourself or to hatch into more chickens. You're not eating fresh bread, because fresh bread requires fresh flour, and flour goes bad quickly, and you can't afford to waste anything. You're not drinking fresh milk, because fresh milk is for rich people and babies who are actively dying. What you're actually eating is a bowl of what can generously be called porridge, made from whatever grain you manage to grow and harvest and store without it rotting, mixed with water that you hope won't kill you, cooked over a fire that fills your house with smoke and makes everything taste like you've been licking the inside of a chimney. The grain itself is an adventure in creative meal planning. If you're lucky, it's mostly barley or oats, but it's probably mixed with whatever else you could find to stretch it further. Acorns that you spent days processing to remove the bitter tannins that would otherwise make you sick. Beans that are hard as rocks and have to be soaked for hours before they're even remotely edible. Seeds from plants that aren't technically food, but won't kill you and provide some nutrition. Sometimes, if things are really bad, ground up bark from trees that you know are safe to eat. The preparation of this grain is itself a nightmare that would send any modern person straight back to bed. You can't just buy oats from the store and pour them into a bowl. You have to start with raw grain that's been sitting in storage for months, probably getting moldy and attracting insects and rodents. First, you have to sort through it by hand, picking out the stones, the bits of wood, the dead insects, the mouse droppings, and anything else that got mixed in during harvesting and storage. Then you have to grind it into something resembling flour, and this is where medieval farm life really shows its teeth. You don't have an electric grain mill, or even a proper hand crank grinder. You have two stones, and you spend hours rubbing grain between them, trying to break it down into pieces small enough to cook. Your arms and shoulders ache from the repetitive motion. Your hands get raw from gripping the rough stone, and the whole process is incredibly inefficient. You're lucky if you can grind enough grain for one meal in an hour of constant work, and the grinding never produces anything like the fine uniform flour you're used to seeing. Instead, you get a mixture of coarse chunks, fine powder, and everything in between. Some pieces are still almost whole grains that will never soften properly during cooking. Others are ground so fine they turn into paste the moment they hit water. Most of it is somewhere in the middle, creating a texture that's like eating wet sand mixed with lumps of dough. The water you're using comes from a well that you dug yourself, if you're lucky enough to have found water on your land. If not, you're carrying water from the nearest stream or river, which means you're drinking whatever's upstream from you, including runoff from other farms, animal waste, and the occasional dead animal that fell in and hasn't been discovered yet. You know the water is dangerous, even if you don't understand exactly why, so you try to boil it when you can. But fuel is precious, and you can't always afford to waste it on water purification. The water collection itself is a daily ordeal that would exhaust most modern people. If you have a well, you're lowering a bucket on a rope down into the dark depths, hoping the rope doesn't break, and trying not to think about what might be floating around down there. The bucket is heavy when it's full, and pulling it up requires strength that you might not have after a day of farm work. If the well runs dry, which happens regularly, you have to walk to the nearest reliable water source, which might be miles away. If you're getting water from a stream or river, you're making multiple trips carrying heavy containers, and you're competing with animals for access to the water. You might arrive at your usual spot to find that someone's cattle have been standing in it, turning the water into a muddy soup mixed with manure. You might discover that something died upstream and the water is full of things you don't want to identify. But you need water, so you take what you can get and hope it won't kill you. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not usually drinking straight water anyway. Most of your liquid intake comes from ale, which sounds fun until you realize that medieval ale is nothing like modern beer. It's weak, sour, and tastes like someone dissolved bread in dirty water and let it sit in the sun for a week. But it's safer than water because the brewing process kills most of the things that would make you sick, and it provides calories that you desperately need. Making this ale is another full-time job that someone in your family has to manage constantly. You start with grain that you can't really afford to spare, but you need the ale to survive, so you make the sacrifice. The grain gets mixed with water and left to ferment, which means you need containers to hold it, space to store those containers, and constant attention to make sure the fermentation process doesn't go wrong and produce something that will poison your entire family. The brewing process itself is finicky and unpredictable. Too much heat and the yeast dies. Too little heat and harmful bacteria take over. The wrong proportion of ingredients and you get something that's either too weak to be useful or too strong to drink regularly. And you're doing all of this without thermometers, without precise measuring tools, without any of the equipment that modern brewers take for granted. When the ale is ready, it doesn't keep well, so you have to drink it relatively quickly or watch it turn into vinegar. This means you're constantly brewing new batches, using up grain and fuel and time that you need for other things. And the end result is a beverage that tastes terrible but keeps you alive, so you drink it anyway. So your breakfast is a bowl of lumpy greyish porridge washed down with sour ale, and you're grateful to have it because yesterday you weren't sure there was going to be enough food to go around. You eat it while standing up, because sitting down to eat is a luxury you can't afford when there's work to be done. And you eat it quickly because the longer you take, the more daylight you're wasting. But let's talk about what this meal actually tastes like, because that's where the reality of medieval farm life really hits home. The porridge doesn't taste like oatmeal or cream of wheat or any of the warm, comforting breakfast foods you might be thinking of. It tastes like wet cardboard mixed with dirt, with occasional crunches from things you really don't want to identify. The grain is coarse and poorly ground because you don't have access to proper milling equipment, so you're basically eating gravel that's been soaked in water until it's soft enough to chew. The texture is probably the most disturbing part. Modern people are used to food that has a consistent, pleasant texture throughout. This porridge is a minefield of different textures that range from unpleasant to revolting. There are hard chunks of incompletely ground grain that you have to chew carefully to avoid breaking a tooth. There are slimy bits where the finer particles have turned into a paste that coats your mouth. There are crunchy bits that might be incompletely processed acorns, or might be insect parts, or might be something else you'd rather not think about. The colour is also deeply unappetizing. Instead of the clean, uniform appearance of modern breakfast foods, this porridge is a mottled greyish-brown that looks like something you'd find in a compost pile. If you've added other ingredients to stretch the grain further, it might have flecks of green from herbs or vegetables, or dark spots from beans, or other colours that don't combine into anything that looks like food. The ale tastes like someone took bread, let it rot, mixed it with water that's been sitting in a bucket for a month, and then added a hint of vinegar for flavour. It's flat, it's warm, and it has chunks of unidentifiable material floating in it that you try not to think about too hard. But you drink it anyway, because you need the calories and the liquid, and it's better than dying of thirst or waterborne illness. The aftertaste lingers in your mouth for hours, a constant reminder of what you've eaten. It's sour and stale and vaguely metallic, probably from the iron pot you cooked in or the minerals in the water. You can't brush your teeth afterward because toothbrushes don't exist, and even if they did, you couldn't afford one, so you carry that taste with you all day, occasionally trying to clear it with another sip of ale that just makes it worse. And this is if you're having a good day. If it's been a bad harvest, or if you're getting close to the end of winter when your stored food is running low, breakfast might be a thin gruel made from whatever you can scrape together. Maybe some grain that started to go mouldy, but isn't completely inedible yet. Maybe some vegetables from last year's harvest that are soft and wrinkled, but still have some nutritional value. Maybe nothing at all, except ale and hope. The mouldy grain deserves special mention because it's a regular feature of medieval farm breakfast, and it would absolutely horrify anyone with modern food safety knowledge. You can't afford to throw away food just because it started to develop some mould, so you carefully examine each batch of grain and make judgments about what's still safe to eat. A little bit of white, fuzzy mould, you brush it off and use the grain anyway. Green mould that doesn't smell too bad, you might risk it if you're desperate enough. Black mould or anything that smells really rotten, that gets thrown away, but only if you have other food to replace it. This constant evaluation of spoiled food means you're regularly eating things that are past their prime, and your digestive system pays the price. Stomach aches are a normal part of life, and you never know if that cramping feeling is from bad food, too little food, or just the stress of trying to survive another day. The portion size would shock anyone used to modern meals. You're not eating until you're full, because there isn't enough food for that. You're eating just enough to give you energy for the morning's work, and you're measuring every bite against the knowledge that whatever you eat now is food you won't have later. Every spoonful of porridge is a calculation. Do I need this energy now, or should I save it for when I'm even hungrier? This constant rationing creates a psychological relationship with food that modern people can't imagine. You never eat without thinking about the cost. Every bite is weighed against future needs, against other family members' hunger, against the possibility that tomorrow there might be even less food available. You develop an ability to function while hungry that would be considered a medical emergency in modern times. But here's what would really disturb a modern person. You're not eating alone. The same bowl that you're eating from is the same bowl your spouse ate from, and your children, and possibly your parents if they're still alive. There's no individual plates or bowls because pottery and metal containers are expensive, and you can't afford to have a separate dish for every person. So you pass the bowl around and everyone eats from the same spoon, and nobody thinks twice about sharing saliva and whatever germs everyone might be carrying. The communal eating implements mean that diseases spread quickly through families, but there's no alternative. A single wooden bowl might be carved by hand from a piece of wood that took days to shape and smooth. A metal spoon might cost more than you make in a month. These aren't things you can replace easily, so you share them and hope that everyone stays healthy. The same goes for the ale. There's one cup, maybe two, if you're relatively well off, and everyone drinks from it. Your 6-year-old child is drinking the same sour ale that you are because it's safer than water and because there's no other option. The idea that children should drink milk or juice or anything specially prepared for them is completely foreign. Children eat what adults eat, in smaller portions, and they're grateful to get it. And speaking of children, they're not sitting politely at a table, waiting for their food to be served. They're running around, trying to help with the morning chores, getting in the way, and begging for food because they're always hungry. You have to balance feeding them enough to keep them alive and healthy against the reality that every bite they take is a bite that someone else in the family doesn't get. It's a horrible calculation that no parent should have to make, but it's daily reality in medieval farm life. The children's relationship with food is particularly heartbreaking from a modern perspective. They don't understand why they can't have as much as they want, why they have to wait their turn, why some days there's less food than others. They're constantly hungry, and their parents have to watch them suffer without being able to do much about it. The children learn early that food is scarce and precious, and they develop survival behaviors that would concern modern child psychologists. You might see a 5-year-old hoarding crumbs, hiding bits of food in case there's nothing to eat later. You might see children fighting over scraps in ways that seem vicious, but are actually just desperate attempts to get enough calories to survive. You might see parents making agonizing decisions about which child gets the larger portion based on who's sickest, or who has the most physically demanding work to do that day. The timing of breakfast is also completely different from what modern people expect. You're not eating when you wake up, because you've been awake for hours already doing essential work that couldn't wait. You're not eating at a regular time, because you eat when you can fit it into the work schedule, and that depends on what crises have developed overnight, and what urgent tasks need to be handled immediately. Some days, breakfast might happen at what we'd consider a normal time. Other days, you might not get to eat until what we'd call lunchtime, because a cow got sick, and you spent the morning trying to save it, or because you had to repair a fence that broke and let your animals wander off, or because you had to deal with some other emergency that took priority over food. This irregular eating schedule plays havoc with your body's natural rhythms. You never know when your next meal is coming, so your body is constantly in a state of stress, trying to conserve energy and prepare for potential starvation. You develop an intimate knowledge of different levels of hunger, from the mild discomfort of skipping a meal to the gnawing pain of going days without adequate food. And the preparation of this sad excuse for a meal is itself a major undertaking that would frustrate any modern person. You can't just turn on a stove and cook something quickly. You have to start a fire, which might take a while if the kindling is damp or if the wind is blowing wrong. You have to maintain the fire at the right temperature, which requires constant attention and adjustment. You have to watch the food carefully to make sure it doesn't burn, because if you ruin it, there might not be anything else to eat. Starting the fire is often the most challenging part of the entire breakfast preparation. If you let the fire die out completely overnight, you have to start from scratch using flint and steel, which requires skill, patience, and dry kindling. In wet weather, finding dry material to burn becomes a serious challenge. You might spend an hour trying to get a fire started, blowing on tiny sparks and nursing them into flames while your family waits hungry for their morning meal. The cooking is done in a pot that hangs over the fire, and controlling the temperature means raising or lowering the pot, or moving it to different parts of the fire, or adding or removing fuel. There are no timers, no thermometers, no measuring cups. Everything is done by experience and guesswork, and if you guess wrong, you might end up with food that's burned on the bottom and raw on top. The pot itself is probably made of iron, if you're lucky enough to afford one, or clay if you're not. Iron pots are expensive but durable, and they're often passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Clay pots are cheaper, but they crack and break, and when they do, you're cooking in whatever other container you can find until you can get a replacement. Either way, the pot is probably stained and seasoned with the residue of thousands of previous meals, and it's never really clean by modern standards. The iron pot, if you have one, is heavy and difficult to handle. It sits over the fire on a hook or chain, and adjusting its position requires strength and careful maneuvering to avoid getting burned. The handle gets hot, so you need rags or wooden tools to move it, and even then you're likely to get burned regularly. The pot retains heat long after cooking, so it becomes a hazard that you have to be careful around for hours. After you've eaten your portion of the porridge, you don't just put the bowl in the dishwasher and move on with your day. You have to clean the pot and the bowl, which means scrubbing them with sand or ash or whatever abrasive material you can find, rinsing them with precious water, and then drying them thoroughly to prevent rust or mold. The cleaning process uses up time and resources that you can't really afford to spare. The cleaning itself is a frustrating process that would drive modern people crazy. Without soap, you're relying on abrasives and hot water to remove the stuck-on food, and it doesn't work very well. The pot always retains some residue from previous meals, building up layers of flavor and potential contamination that you can't completely remove. You scrub until your hands are raw, rinse with water you can't afford to waste, and accept that the pot will never be truly clean. But let's talk about what happens when the food runs out, because that's a reality that medieval farm families faced regularly. You wake up one morning and realize that the grain storage is empty. The preserved vegetables are gone, and there's nothing left to make porridge with. Now what? This is when breakfast becomes a desperate scavenger hunt for anything edible. You might boil leather scraps to make a broth that has some nutritional value. You might grind up acorns or roots that you've been saving for emergencies. You might kill one of your chickens, even though you can't afford to lose the eggs it might have laid. You might send your children out to look for berries or nuts or anything growing wild that might be safe to eat. The leather broth deserves special mention because it represents the absolute bottom of the food chain for medieval farm families. When you have literally nothing else to eat, you take scraps of leather from old shoes or equipment, boil them for hours to soften them up and extract whatever protein and minerals you can. The result is a grey, gelatinous liquid that tastes like what you'd imagine licking a boot would taste like, but it has some nutritional value and it fills your stomach. Foraging becomes a desperate daily activity. When stored food runs out, you send family members into the woods and fields to look for anything edible, knowing that one mistake could poison someone. Wild berries, nuts, roots, bark from certain trees, even grass and leaves become potential food sources, but you're competing with wild animals for these resources, and you don't really know which plants are safe and which will kill you. The children become particularly important for foraging because they're small enough to get into places adults can't reach, and they have the energy to spend hours searching for food. But this means putting children at risk, sending them into dangerous areas where they might get lost, injured, or eaten by wild animals. It's another impossible choice that medieval parents had to make regularly. Or you might just not have breakfast at all. You might drink some ale or thin broth and call it a meal, then go out to do a full day of physical labor on an empty stomach, hoping that you'll find something to eat later in the day. This isn't an occasional occurrence. It's a regular part of life for many medieval farm families. Working without breakfast becomes a test of physical and mental endurance that would challenge modern athletes. You're doing manual labor that requires strength and coordination while your blood sugar is crashing and your body is cannibalizing its own muscle for energy. You develop techniques for conserving energy, moving efficiently, and staying focused despite the constant distraction of hunger. And here's something that would horrify modern parents. Your children are experiencing this same food insecurity. They're going to bed hungry, waking up hungry, and spending their days wondering when they'll get to eat again. They're not growing as tall or as strong as they could be if they had adequate nutrition, and they're more susceptible to disease and injury because their bodies are constantly stressed by hunger. The children's stunted growth becomes visible evidence of the family's struggle. By modern standards, most medieval farm children would be considered severely malnourished. They're shorter, thinner, and weaker than children with adequate nutrition, and they carry the physical and psychological scars of chronic hunger throughout their lives. The social dynamics around breakfast are also completely different from modern family meals. There's no leisurely conversation, no discussion of plans for the day, no bonding time around the table. Everyone is focused on eating as efficiently as possible and getting to work. The adults are already thinking about the day's tasks and problems, and the children are trying to get enough food to keep them going while also staying out of the way. Conversation during meals, when it happens at all, tends to focus on practical matters: what work needs to be done, what problems have developed, what resources are available. There's no discussion of hopes and dreams or philosophical questions, because survival takes all your mental energy. The meal becomes a brief logistics meeting rather than a social experience. And there's always the awareness that this meal might be the last one for a while. If something goes wrong during the day, if there's an accident or a crisis or an unexpected expense, this bowl of porridge might be all the food you get until tomorrow or longer. So you eat with a kind of desperate gratitude, appreciating every bite while also mourning the fact that it's not more satisfying or nutritious. The seasonal variation in breakfast would also be shocking to modern people. In late summer and early fall, when the harvest is fresh, breakfast might actually be somewhat decent. The grain is newer and tastes better. There might be some fresh vegetables to add to the porridge, and there's a sense of abundance that makes the meal more enjoyable. During harvest season, you might actually have what could be called a good breakfast. Fresh grain that hasn't had time to go stale or mouldy, vegetables that haven't been stored for months, maybe even some fresh fruit if you're lucky. This is the one time of year when food is relatively plentiful, and families try to eat as well as possible to build up strength for the lean months ahead. But by late winter and early spring, breakfast becomes a grim exercise in survival. The grain has been stored for months and is starting to go bad. The vegetables are long gone. The preserved meat, if you had any, is either used up or so salty and tough that it's barely edible. This is when breakfast becomes a thin gruel made from whatever you can scrape together, and you're counting the days until the next harvest. The spring hunger is legendary in medieval history. This is when families who made it through winter finally start to break under the pressure of months of inadequate nutrition. People become weak, sick, and desperate. The stored food is almost gone, but the new crops won't be ready for months. This is when people die, not from dramatic causes, but from the slow, grinding process of malnutrition. And if the previous year's harvest was bad, breakfast in the spring might be nothing more than hot water with a few crumbs of bread, or ale so thin it's basically flavored water. This is when people start dying, not from dramatic causes, but from the slow grinding process of malnutrition. They get sick more easily, they heal more slowly, and eventually their bodies just give up. The psychological impact of chronic hunger is something modern people can't fully understand. When you're never quite getting enough to eat, your entire personality changes. You become obsessed with food, thinking about it constantly, planning every meal, dreaming about better times. You become irritable, depressed, and anxious. Your ability to think clearly and make good decisions deteriorates. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval farm breakfast is the complete lack of variety. You're not deciding between cereal and eggs and toast and fruit. You're eating the same porridge day after day, month after month, year after year. The only variation comes from how desperate things are and what you've managed to add to stretch the grain further. The monotony of the diet creates a psychological numbing that protects people from the full horror of their situation. You stop thinking about food as something that should be enjoyable or satisfying and start thinking about it purely as fuel. The idea that eating could be pleasurable becomes foreign, almost incomprehensible. There's no such thing as comfort food, because food isn't about comfort. It's about survival. There's no such thing as favorite foods, because you eat what you can get. There's no such thing as dietary preferences, because preferences are a luxury that only people with abundant food can afford. So when you imagine breakfast on a medieval farm, don't think about a cozy kitchen with a family gathered around a table, sharing a hearty meal and planning their day. Think about desperate people eating grim food as quickly as possible, so they can get back to the endless work of trying to stay alive. Think about parents rationing food to their children, and children going to bed hungry. Think about the constant fear that this meal might be the last one for a while. That's the reality of breakfast on a medieval farm. Not a pleasant start to the day, but a daily reminder of how precarious life is when you're living on the edge of survival, measuring every bite against the possibility of starvation, and grateful for food that would make a modern person gag. It's a meal that represents everything harsh and unforgiving about medieval life, served up with a side of desperation and washed down with the bitter taste of just trying to make it through another day. The bell tolls at 3 in the morning, cutting through the darkness like a blade through silence, and Brother Thomas jerks awake on his straw pallet, knowing that in 30 minutes he'll be standing in a stone chapel, so cold his breath will form clouds, chanting Latin words that have lost all meaning, except as markers of time until the next meal. But calling it a meal is generous, because what passes for food in a 12th century monastery would make a modern person question whether the monks are trying to achieve spiritual enlightenment or just seeing how long the human body can survive on what amounts to elaborate starvation. You have to understand something about medieval monastic life that most people completely miss. These aren't well-fed, rosy-cheeked monks sitting around illuminated manuscripts with tankards of ale. These are men who have taken vows of poverty so seriously that they've turned self-deprivation into an art form, and nowhere is this more apparent than in what they laughingly call their meals. Brother Thomas stumbles through the dormitory, stepping over the sleeping forms of 40 other monks, crammed into a room that would be considered overcrowded for 20 people. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, because bathing is considered a luxury that interferes with spiritual discipline, and the sound of coughing and snoring that comes from men whose bodies are slowly breaking down under the strain of chronic malnutrition and constant cold. The dormitory itself is a testament to the monastery's commitment to making life as uncomfortable as possible. The stone walls weep with moisture that never dries, creating a constant dampness that seeps into everything. The windows are nothing more than holes in the wall with wooden shutters, because glass is a luxury that would interfere with the monk's spiritual development. In winter, the choice is between freezing with the shutters open or suffocating in stale air with them closed. The sleeping arrangements would violate every modern standard of privacy and hygiene. 40 grown men sleep on straw pallets, arranged in rows so close together that you can't turn over without bumping into your neighbour. The straw is changed maybe twice a year, if they're lucky, so most of the time they're sleeping on decomposing vegetation that's home to fleas, lice and other insects that feast on human blood throughout the night. Brother Thomas has learned to sleep in a specific position that minimizes contact with the worst parts of his palate. But after 8 years, there's no position that's comfortable. His hip bones press against the thin straw and the stone floor beneath, creating pressure sores that never quite heal. His spine has developed a permanent curve from trying to find positions that don't cause immediate pain, and he wakes up every morning feeling like he's been beaten with clubs. He makes his way to the chapel, where the stones seem to suck the warmth out of anything that comes near them. The building was designed to inspire awe and humility, and it succeeds by making everyone inside feel like insects in a vast, hostile universe. The monks file in silently, because talking during the night offices is forbidden, and they stand in their assigned places wearing rough wool robes that provide about as much warmth as a wet towel. The robes themselves are instruments of torture, disguised as religious garments. They're made from the coarsest wool available, deliberately chosen to be uncomfortable against the skin. The fabric is rough and scratchy, causing constant irritation that serves as a reminder of the monk's commitment to suffering. The robes are also deliberately too large, hanging loose and shapeless to hide the human form and prevent any possibility of vanity or pride in appearance. Brother Thomas's robe is the same one he was given when he entered the monastery 8 years ago, and it's never been properly cleaned because washing clothes too frequently is considered a form of self-indulgence. The fabric is stained with years of sweat, food spills, and other bodily fluids, and it smells like a combination of mildew, unwashed human, and something that might have died in the wool before it was woven. The service lasts 2 hours, during which Brother Thomas tries to keep his mind on prayer while his stomach gnaws at itself with a hunger that's become his constant companion. He's been in the monastery for 8 years, and he can't remember the last time he felt genuinely full, not satisfied, not content, but actually full in the way that modern people take for granted after every meal. The Latin chanting that fills the chapel is beautiful in theory, but in practice it becomes a form of endurance test for men whose bodies are slowly failing. Standing for 2 hours on a stone floor in a freezing building while experiencing the physical pain of chronic hunger requires a level of mental discipline that would challenge professional athletes. Brother Thomas has learned to enter a kind of trance state during services, detaching his mind from his body's suffering while still participating in the required responses and movements. The chapel itself is designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, following the principle that physical comfort interferes with spiritual development. There are no seats, no cushions, no concessions to human frailty. The stone floor is uneven and treacherous, worn smooth by centuries of feet, but still full of unexpected dips and rises that can cause stumbles and falls. The walls are bare stone, with no decoration or ornamentation that might provide visual comfort or distraction. When the service finally ends, the monks file out in the same oppressive silence and return to their dormitory for another hour of sleep before the next bell. But Brother Thomas can't sleep because his hunger has reached the point where it's physically painful, a cramping sensation that radiates from his stomach through his entire body. He lies on his straw pallet, which is barely thicker than the stone floor beneath it, and tries to think about God instead of food, but his traitorous mind keeps drifting to memories of meals from before he took his vows. These memories of his former life have become both a comfort and a torment. He remembers his mother's bread, baked fresh every few days and still warm from the oven when he ate it. He remembers meals where there was enough food for everyone, where people ate until they were satisfied rather than just barely alive. He remembers the taste of meat, the richness of butter, the sweetness of honey, flavors that have become so foreign to him that they seem like fantasies from another world. But these memories are also dangerous, because dwelling on them can lead to despair, and despair is a sin that can damn a soul to hell. Brother Thomas has learned to cut off these thoughts when they begin, replacing them with prayers or meditation, but the hunger makes it difficult to maintain mental discipline. His starving brain craves not just food, but the memory of food, the idea of food, anything that can provide even imaginary relief from the constant gnawing emptiness. The second bell rings at 5, calling the monks to lauds, another service of chanting and prayer that lasts until dawn. By the time it's over, Brother Thomas has been awake for 4 hours and hasn't eaten anything in 14 hours, and his body is running on whatever reserves it can find, which isn't much because he's been operating at a caloric deficit for years. His body has adapted to chronic starvation in ways that would alarm modern doctors. His metabolism has slowed dramatically to conserve energy, which means he feels cold constantly and moves more slowly than he used to. His muscle mass has decreased to the point where tasks that used to be easy now require significant effort. His immune system is so compromised that minor illnesses that his body used to fight off easily now become serious threats to his survival. The physical effects of prolonged malnutrition are visible in every aspect of his appearance. His face is gaunt, with sunken cheeks and prominent cheekbones that give him a skeletal appearance. His eyes have retreated into their sockets, surrounded by dark circles that never go away. His hair has thinned and turned grey prematurely, and his skin has a yellowish, unhealthy colour that comes from years of inadequate nutrition. Finally comes the sound he's been waiting for. The bell that calls the community to the refectory for the first meal of the day. But if you're imagining a warm, welcoming dining hall filled with the aroma of fresh bread and hearty soup, you need to adjust your expectations downward by about 1,000%. The refectory is another stone chamber, designed to remind everyone that comfort is the enemy of salvation. Long wooden tables stretch across the room, worn smooth by decades of use, and scrubbed clean with sand and cold water. There are no chairs, because sitting comfortably while eating might lead to the sin of gluttony. So the monks stand at their assigned places, hands folded, waiting for permission to approach their meal. The tables themselves tell the story of monastic austerity. They're made from rough-hewn planks that were never properly finished, so splinters are a constant hazard. The wood is stained and scarred from years of use, with knife marks where countless monks have cut their bread and dents, where bowls have been set down too forcefully. The surface is uneven, causing bowls to wobble and spill their precious contents if not placed carefully. And here's where the reality of monastic dining would break the spirit of any modern person. There's no conversation. None. Meals are eaten in complete silence, while one monk stands at a lectern, reading from scripture or the lives of the saints. The only sounds are the scraping of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, and the occasional cough or sniffle from men whose bodies are slowly surrendering to the combined effects of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The silence during meals is absolute and enforced with severe penalties. Any monk who speaks during a meal faces punishment that might include additional fasting, physical labour, or even expulsion from the community. The silence is supposed to allow the monks to focus on the spiritual reading and to prevent the meal from becoming a social occasion that might lead to pleasure or distraction from religious duties. Brother Thomas approaches his place at the table and looks down at what the monastery kitchen has produced for breakfast, and the word meal becomes a cruel joke. In a wooden bowl that's been carved from a single piece of wood and never quite gets clean, no matter how much you scrub it, there's a portion of what can charitably be called porridge, but looks more like thin gruel that someone forgot to finish cooking. The bowl itself is a work of functional misery. It's carved from wood that's been used so long, it's absorbed the flavours and odours of thousands of previous meals, creating a permanent taste that mingles with whatever food is placed in it. The wood is cracked and stained, with deep grooves that harbour bacteria and food particles no amount of scrubbing can remove. The rim is chipped and rough, making it uncomfortable to drink from and likely to cut lips that are already cracked from malnutrition and cold. The base of this porridge is barley, if they're lucky, or oats if they're not, mixed with whatever the monastery can afford or grow in its gardens. But monasteries aren't known for their agricultural abundance, especially Cistercian houses that deliberately choose poor, difficult land as part of their commitment to poverty. So the grain is usually whatever the brothers manage to coax from soil that barely supports weeds, ground by hand in stone querns that produce a coarse, gritty flour that never quite breaks down into anything resembling smooth porridge. The monastery's agricultural situation is a perfect example of how religious ideology can conflict with practical survival. The monks have deliberately chosen land that no sane farmer would try to cultivate, rocky hillsides and marshy valleys that flood in spring and bake to hardpan in summer. They've done this as a form of penance, believing that working difficult land will bring them closer to God through suffering. The result is crops that barely survive, producing grain that's often diseased, stunted, or contaminated with ergot fungus that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The monks have learned to identify the worst of the contaminated grain and remove it, but they can't afford to be too picky, so they end up eating grain that would be rejected by even the poorest peasant farmers. The texture is the first thing that would revolt a modern person. It's lumpy and uneven, with chunks of incompletely ground grain that you have to chew carefully to avoid breaking a tooth, mixed with sections that have dissolved into a paste that coats your mouth with a film that tastes like wet chalk. The colour is a dispiriting greyish-brown that suggests something that died and was left in water too long. The grinding process itself is a source of additional contamination and discomfort. The stone querns used to grind the grain are ancient and worn, with surfaces that are no longer smooth. This means that tiny particles of stone get mixed into the flour, creating a gritty texture that wears down teeth and causes constant irritation to the mouth and digestive system. Brother Thomas has lost several teeth over the years, not from decay, but from the constant grinding action of stone particles in his food. But the real horror is in what's missing. There's no salt, because salt is expensive, and seasoning food for pleasure, rather than simple sustenance, is considered a form of indulgence that interferes with spiritual development. There's no butter or milk, because those are luxuries that the monks have sworn to avoid. There's no honey or fruit, because sweetness is pleasure, and pleasure is the path to damnation. The absence of salt creates more than just a flavour problem. Salt is essential for human health, helping to regulate fluid balance and nerve function. The chronic salt deficiency that monks experience leads to muscle cramps, weakness, and confusion that they attribute to spiritual trials, but are actually symptoms of severe nutritional deficiency. What you get instead is the pure, unadulterated taste of grain and water, with perhaps a hint of whatever minerals were in the water and whatever residue was left in the pot from previous meals. It tastes like what you'd imagine eating paste would taste like, if paste was somehow less flavourful and more depressing. The water used in cooking comes from the monastery's well, which is often contaminated with runoff from the surrounding area. The monks don't understand the connection between water quality and disease, so they use whatever water is available, often from sources that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. The water has a metallic taste from the iron and minerals in the soil, and sometimes a sulphurous odour that makes the porridge smell like rotten eggs. The portion size would shock anyone used to modern breakfast portions. The bowl is small, maybe 6 inches across, and it's not filled to the brim. The monks are allotted just enough food to keep them from dying, because the goal isn't nourishment, it's survival at the absolute minimum level necessary to continue their religious duties. Brother Thomas can finish his entire breakfast in maybe 10 spoonfuls, and each spoonful is measured and deliberate, because once it's gone, there won't be any more until the next meal. The portion control is strictly enforced by the monastery's officials, who measure out each serving with mathematical precision. There's no second helpings, no extra portions for monks who are larger or doing more physical work, no accommodation for individual needs or preferences. Everyone gets exactly the same amount, regardless of their size, age, or health status. He eats slowly, not because he's savoring the food, which would be impossible, but because eating slowly helps create the illusion of having more food than he actually does. Each spoonful is chewed thoroughly, not for digestion, but to make the experience last as long as possible. He's developed techniques over the years for making meager portions feel more substantial, taking smaller bites, pausing between spoonfuls, focusing intensely on the physical act of eating to distract from the inadequacy of the quantity. The eating utensils are as uncomfortable as everything else in the monastery. The spoon is carved from wood and shaped more for durability than comfort. It's too large for the small portions and has a rough surface that irritates the lips and tongue. The handle is thick and unwieldy, making it difficult to maneuver delicate bites, and the bowl of the spoon is shallow, so it's impossible to get a satisfying mouthful of food. While he eats, Brother Benedict stands at the lectern reading from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the document that governs every aspect of monastic life, including the reminder that monks should eat just enough to sustain life and no more. The irony isn't lost on Brother Thomas that he's listening to instructions about the dangers of gluttony while experiencing the constant gnawing hunger of someone who hasn't had an adequate meal in years. The reading selection is carefully chosen to reinforce the monastery's approach to food and eating. Stories of saints who survived on impossibly small amounts of food, theological discussions about the spiritual benefits of hunger, and detailed instructions about how to avoid the sin of gluttony fill the air while the monks struggle to consume their inadequate portions. The reading continues with stories of saints who performed miraculous feats of self-denial, including several who survived on nothing but bread and water for years, or who ate only on Sundays, or who found ways to make even the smallest portions of food last for days. These stories are meant to be inspiring, but to Brother Thomas they sound like descriptions of torture methods designed by people who had never actually experienced real hunger. Saint Simon Stylites, who lived on top of a pillar for 30 years, eating only what visitors could lift up to him in a basket. Saint Mary of Egypt, who survived in the desert for 47 years, eating only 3 loaves of bread and whatever plants she could find. Saint Catherine of Siena, who allegedly lived for years on nothing but communion wafers and water. These stories become a form of psychological torture for men who are already pushing the limits of human endurance. Around him, the other monks are having their own private struggles with their portions. Brother William, who came to the monastery as a young man and is now in his 50s, has developed a tremor in his hands that makes it difficult for him to lift the spoon to his mouth without spilling. Brother Jerome, who worked as a blacksmith before taking vows, has lost so much weight that his robe hangs on him like a tent, and his eyes have the sunken, desperate look of someone whose body is consuming itself to stay alive. Brother William's condition is particularly disturbing because it represents what awaits all the monks if they survive long enough. The tremor isn't just from age, it's from neurological damage caused by chronic malnutrition. His muscles have atrophied to the point where he can barely lift his arms, and his coordination is so poor that he often spills more food than he manages to eat. The other monks have learned to ignore his struggles, not out of cruelty, but because acknowledging the suffering of others makes it harder to bear your own. Brother Peter, the youngest member of the community, still sometimes breaks down crying during meals, overwhelmed by the combination of hunger and the realization that this is his life now forever, until he dies. The older monks have learned to ignore these displays, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, because acknowledging the suffering of others makes it harder to bear your own. Brother Peter entered the monastery only 2 years ago, and he hasn't yet developed the psychological defenses that allow the older monks to endure their situation. He came from a relatively prosperous family and had never experienced real hunger before taking his vows. The shock of constant malnutrition has been devastating to his mental health, and he frequently has episodes of despair that would be considered mental health emergencies in modern times. The meal ends when the reader closes the book, which happens exactly 20 minutes after it began, regardless of whether anyone has finished eating. Not that finishing is usually a problem, since there's so little food that most monks are done within the first 10 minutes and spend the remaining time listening to their stomachs growl and trying to convince themselves that they're not still hungry. The timing of meals is rigidly controlled, not based on hunger or satiation, but on the monastery's schedule of prayers and work. This creates a constant state of anxiety among the monks, who know that they have a limited time to consume their food and no opportunity for additional eating if they don't finish within the allotted time. Brother Thomas scrapes his bowl clean with his wooden spoon, getting every last trace of the porridge, because leaving food behind is both wasteful and a missed opportunity for caloric intake. The bowl is so thoroughly cleaned that it barely needs washing, but the monks will scrub it anyway, because cleanliness is next to godliness, even when there's nothing to clean. The scraping of spoons against wooden bowls creates a sound that's both desperate and pathetic. Dozens of starving men trying to extract every possible calorie from containers that are already empty. The sound echoes through the stone refectory like a percussion section made up of people who are slowly dying of hunger. After breakfast, the monks file out of the refectory in the same oppressive silence they maintain everywhere except during designated speaking times. Brother Thomas returns to his assigned work, which today involves copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, a job that requires fine motor control and mental concentration that becomes increasingly difficult when your body is operating on starvation rations. The scriptorium is another stone chamber, this one filled with wooden desks and uncomfortable stools where monks spend hours hunched over parchment, copying religious texts by hand. The work is meticulous and demanding, requiring perfect letter formation and absolute accuracy, because mistakes in religious texts are considered sins that could affect the salvation of future readers. The desks are designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, following the monastery's principle that physical comfort interferes with spiritual development. They're too low for most people, causing back strain and neck pain, and the stools have no backs or cushions, so sitting for long periods becomes a form of torture. The writing surface is rough wood that catches quill pens and causes ink to splatter, making the already difficult work even more challenging. Brother Thomas settles at his desk and tries to focus on the Latin text he's copying, but his hunger makes it difficult to concentrate. The letters seem to swim on the page, and his hand trembles slightly as he tries to form perfect characters with a quill pen that needs constant attention. His stomach growls audibly, and Brother Francis at the next desk gives him a sympathetic look, because they all understand the challenge of doing intellectual work while slowly starving. The hunger affects his vision in ways that make the detailed work almost impossible. His eyes have trouble focusing, and he often has to stop and rest, because the letters blur together. His hand shakes from low blood sugar, making it difficult to form the precise characters required for religious manuscripts. The combination of hunger, cold, and poor lighting creates working conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. The morning work period lasts until the bell rings for sext, the midday prayer service, which means another hour of standing in the cold chapel, chanting Latin and trying to keep his mind on God instead of on the fact that it's been 4 hours since his inadequate breakfast and he won't get any more food for another 2 hours. The anticipation of the next meal becomes a form of torture that modern people can't imagine. Brother Thomas finds himself thinking about food constantly, planning how he'll eat his next portion, remembering meals from years past, fantasizing about foods he'll never taste again. The obsession with food becomes so intense that he sometimes feels guilty about it, wondering if his constant hunger is a sign of spiritual weakness or if it's just his body's natural response to chronic deprivation. The food fantasies become incredibly elaborate and detailed. He imagines the texture of fresh bread, the smell of roasted meat, the taste of ripe fruit. These fantasies are so vivid that they sometimes provide temporary relief from hunger, but they also make the return to reality more painful. He's developed a complex internal catalogue of every meal he can remember from his life before the monastery, and he reviews these memories like a miser counting coins. When the bell finally rings for the midday meal, Brother Thomas practically runs to the refectory, though he tries to maintain the dignified pace expected of a monk. The anticipation has built up over hours, and he's hoping against hope that somehow today's meal will be different, more substantial, more satisfying. But of course, it's not. The midday meal consists of the same porridge as breakfast, with the possible addition of a small piece of bread that's so hard it has to be soaked in the porridge to make it chewable. The bread is made from the same coarse grain as the porridge, mixed with water and baked into dense, heavy loaves that provide maximum nutrition per ingredient, but minimum pleasure per bite. The bread has the texture of compressed sawdust and tastes like what you'd imagine licking a stone would taste like. It's dark brown or grey, depending on what grain was available, and it's often mouldy around the edges because the monastery can't afford to throw away food just because it's starting to spoil. The monks have learned to scrape off the obvious mould and eat the rest, because wasting food is a sin and they can't afford to be picky. The bread-making process in the monastery is another exercise in making the minimum acceptable product. The grain is ground coarsely, mixed with water and a small amount of yeast if it's available, and baked in ovens that don't heat evenly. The result is bread that's burned on the outside and sometimes raw in the middle, with a texture that's closer to hardtack than anything a modern person would recognize as bread. Sometimes, if the monastery has been particularly blessed, or if it's a feast day, there might be a small portion of vegetables added to the meal. But these aren't the fresh, flavorful vegetables you might imagine. They're usually turnips or cabbage that have been stored for months in root cellars, wrinkled and tough and bitter from age. They're boiled until they're soft enough to chew, which removes most of their nutritional value and all of their flavor, leaving behind something that tastes like salted water with a vaguely vegetable-like texture. The root cellar where vegetables are stored is a damp, dark space that's perfect for growing mold and bacteria. The vegetables that emerge from storage are often more rotten than fresh, with soft spots and discolored areas that have to be cut away. What's left is usually stringy, bitter, and lacking in nutritional value, but it's still better than nothing, so the monks eat it gratefully. On very rare occasions, perhaps once a month, there might be a tiny portion of fish added to the meal, but this isn't fresh fish prepared with herbs and spices. It's usually salted fish that's been preserved for months, so salty that it burns your mouth, and so tough that it's like chewing leather. The salt content is so high that it actually makes you thirstier than you were before eating. But water is rationed too, so you have to balance the need for hydration against the desire to consume every possible calorie. The fish is often of questionable quality, having been preserved when it was already past its prime and stored in conditions that would horrify a modern health inspector. It has a strong, unpleasant smell and a texture that suggests it might have been dead for a very long time before it was salted. But protein is protein, and the monks eat it gratefully because they know it might be weeks before they see fish again. The preservation process for fish involves packing it in salt and storing it in wooden barrels that are often infested with insects and rodents. The fish that emerges from this process is barely recognizable as something that once lived in water. It's dried, blackened, and so saturated with salt that it has to be soaked for hours before it's edible. And even then, it tastes more like salt than fish. Brother Thomas eats his midday meal with the same careful attention he brings to breakfast, savoring each bite, not because it tastes good, but because he knows it's all he's going to get. The portion is slightly larger than breakfast, but not by much, and it's still nowhere near enough to satisfy his hunger. He finishes eating and still feels empty, hollow, like there's a void in his center that food can't fill because there's never enough food to fill it. The afternoon brings more work, more prayer, more standing in cold stone chambers, while his body slowly consumes itself for energy. By evening, Brother Thomas is light-headed with hunger, struggling to concentrate on even simple tasks and fighting off fantasies about food that become more elaborate and desperate as the day progresses. The light-headedness becomes dangerous during afternoon work periods. Monks have been known to faint while working, falling from ladders or collapsing over their manuscripts. Brother Thomas has learned to recognize the warning signs of impending collapse and to find ways to rest without appearing to be shirking his duties. The evening meal, which sounds like it should be the main meal of the day, is actually smaller than the midday meal, because the monks are supposed to eat less as the day progresses, following the theory that eating too much before sleep leads to sinful dreams. So dinner consists of an even smaller portion of porridge, sometimes with a piece of bread so small it's barely worth the effort of chewing. The theory behind reducing food intake throughout the day is based on medieval medical beliefs that are completely wrong by modern standards. The monks believe that eating too much in the evening causes bad dreams, lustful thoughts, and other spiritual problems. In reality, the reduced evening meal just makes it more difficult for their already malnourished bodies to repair themselves during sleep. But here's where monastic dining reaches its absolute nadir: fasting days. The church calendar is packed with fasting days, when monks are supposed to eat even less than usual to demonstrate their devotion and to mortify the flesh. On these days, which occur several times a week, meals are reduced to tiny portions that wouldn't satisfy a small child, let alone a grown man doing physical labor. The fasting calendar is so complex and demanding that keeping track of it becomes a full-time job. There are fasting days for saints, fasting days for seasons, fasting days for penance, and fasting days that seem to exist for no reason other than to make life more difficult. By the time all the fasting requirements are added up, monks are eating reduced portions more often than they're eating normal portions. During Lent, the fasting becomes so severe that it's essentially legalized starvation. For 40 days, the monks eat one small meal per day, consisting of bread and water, with maybe a few vegetables if they're available. No porridge, no fish, no dairy products, just the absolute minimum necessary to keep body and soul together. By the end of Lent, many monks are so weak they can barely stand, and some don't survive the experience. Brother Thomas has lived through 8 Lenten seasons since joining the monastery, and each one has been a battle for survival that tested the limits of human endurance. He's learnt to move slowly to conserve energy, to sleep as much as possible, to avoid thinking about food, and to focus obsessively on prayer as a distraction from the physical pain of prolonged hunger. The Lenten fast creates a form of collective suffering that transforms the entire monastery. Monks who were barely functional before Lent become walking skeletons, moving slowly and speaking in whispers when they're allowed to speak at all. The mortality rate during Lent is significantly higher than at other times of the year, but this is considered a sign of spiritual purification rather than medical neglect. The psychological effects of this chronic malnutrition are devastating in ways that would alarm modern doctors. Brother Thomas experiences mood swings, depression, anxiety, and periods of confused thinking that make it difficult to perform even simple tasks. His memory has deteriorated, and he sometimes finds himself staring at a page of text for minutes at a time without comprehending what it says. The cognitive effects of starvation are well documented by modern science, but medieval monks interpreted them as spiritual experiences. The hallucinations caused by severe malnutrition were considered visions from God. The confusion and disorientation were seen as signs of divine inspiration. The mood swings and depression were viewed as necessary steps in the purification of the soul. His body has adapted to the chronic food shortage in ways that would be considered medical emergencies in modern times. His metabolism has slowed to conserve energy, his muscle mass has decreased dramatically, and his immune system is so compromised that he gets sick from minor illnesses that his body used to fight off easily. He's lost teeth from malnutrition, his hair has thinned and turned grey prematurely, and his skin has a sallow, unhealthy appearance that comes from years of inadequate nutrition. The physical deterioration is progressive and irreversible. Once the body begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy, the process continues even when small amounts of food are available. Brother Thomas is effectively dying slowly, his body consuming itself to stay alive, while his mind tries to find spiritual meaning in the suffering. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of monastic meals is how they've warped Brother Thomas's relationship with food entirely. He no longer thinks of eating as something that could be pleasurable or satisfying. Food has become purely functional, a necessary evil that keeps him alive long enough to serve God. The idea that people might eat for enjoyment, or that meals could be social occasions, or that food could be prepared to taste good rather than just provide minimal nutrition, has become foreign to him. He's developed what modern psychologists would recognize as disordered eating patterns. He hoards scraps of food when he can, hiding them in his cell for emergencies. He eats incredibly slowly, trying to make each bite last as long as possible. He obsesses over food constantly, planning meals days in advance, remembering every bite he's eaten, fantasizing about foods he'll never taste again. The hoarding behavior is particularly dangerous because it violates monastic rules about personal property. If Brother Thomas is caught with hidden food, he faces severe punishment that could include additional fasting or even expulsion from the community. But the drive to hoard food is so strong that he takes the risk anyway, hiding crumbs of bread in his sleeve or under his mattress like a starving animal. The social dynamics of monastic dining would also be shocking to modern people. There's no sense of community or fellowship around meals, no conversation, no sharing of experiences or emotions. The meals are eaten in isolation, despite being surrounded by other people, because talking is forbidden, and because each monk is focused entirely on his own portion and his own hunger. The silence during meals creates an atmosphere of tension and desperation that's palpable. You can hear stomachs growling, spoons scraping against bowls, the occasional sigh or suppressed groan of someone whose hunger has become physically painful. The monks eat with a kind of grim determination, knowing that this small portion of inadequate food is all they'll get until the next meal. And there's always the awareness that this isn't temporary. This isn't a diet or a cleanse or a spiritual retreat that will end after a few days or weeks. This is life forever, until death provides the only escape from constant hunger. Brother Thomas will eat these same inadequate meals every day for the rest of his life, which probably won't be very long given the effects of chronic malnutrition on the human body. The monastery's approach to food is based on the belief that physical comfort interferes with spiritual development, that hunger and suffering purify the soul and bring monks closer to God. But the reality is that chronic malnutrition makes it harder to think clearly, harder to concentrate on prayer, harder to perform the intellectual and physical work that monasteries are supposed to accomplish. The theological justification for starvation is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and spiritual development. Far from bringing the monks closer to God, the constant hunger makes them obsessed with physical needs, unable to focus on anything beyond their next meal. The suffering doesn't purify their souls, it breaks their spirits and destroys their bodies. So when you imagine a meal in a 12th century monastery, don't think about jolly monks enjoying hearty food and good fellowship. Think about desperate, hungry men eating barely edible food in complete silence, measuring every bite against the knowledge that it's all they'll get, slowly starving in the name of spiritual purity, while their bodies break down and their minds struggle to function on inadequate nutrition. That's the reality of monastic dining, not a spiritual experience that brings men closer to God, but a form of legalized torture that destroys the body in the name of saving the soul, creating communities of walking skeletons who have forgotten what it feels like to be truly fed and who will carry the physical and psychological scars of chronic hunger until their malnourished bodies finally give up the struggle to survive. The candle flickers and dies at midnight, plunging Brother Aldrich into darkness so complete that he literally cannot see his own hand pressed against his face. And for the next 6 hours he'll sit hunched over a writing desk in a stone chamber that feels like the inside of a tomb, copying Latin texts by the light of whatever meagre flame he can coax from a wick that costs more than most people make in a week, slowly going blind and mad in the service of preserving knowledge that maybe 12 people in the entire world can actually read. This is the reality that would shatter every romantic notion you have about medieval scribes. They're not scholarly gentlemen in cozy libraries, surrounded by leather-bound books and warm fireplaces, contemplating the great questions of philosophy, while sipping wine from crystal goblets. They're isolated, half-starved men slowly destroying their bodies and minds in cold, dark rooms, copying the same texts over and over again until their fingers are permanently deformed, their spines are twisted into permanent curves, and their eyes are so damaged from straining in poor light that many of them are functionally blind by the age of 40. Brother Aldrich has been a scribe for 15 years, ever since he entered the monastery at age 20, and every day of those 15 years has been a battle against conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. He wakes before dawn in a dormitory so cold that water freezes in the basins, pulls on robes that are stiff with ice, and makes his way through stone corridors to a scriptorium that's barely warmer than the outside air, where he'll spend the next 12 hours bent over manuscripts that he's copying by hand, one letter at a time, with tools that barely work and materials that cost more than most families see in a year. The scriptorium itself is a monument to human suffering disguised as scholarly pursuit. It's a long, narrow room with thick stone walls that seem to absorb warmth and light, making everything inside feel dead and hollow. The windows are nothing more than slits in the wall, designed more for defense than illumination. So even on the brightest days, the interior is dim and shadowy. In winter, when the sun barely rises above the horizon, the room is so dark that working without candles is impossible. But candles are expensive and rationed, so most of the time the scribes work in light so poor that they have to hold their faces inches from the parchment just to see what they're writing. The writing desks are instruments of torture that would make a medieval executioner proud. They're slanted at an angle that forces the scribe to lean forward in an unnatural position, putting enormous strain on the neck, shoulders, and spine. The height of the desk means that the scribe has to hunch over his work, and there's no back support, so after a few hours the pain becomes excruciating. Brother Aldrich's spine has developed a permanent curve from 15 years of this position, and he can no longer stand up straight, even when he's not working. The stools are equally designed for maximum discomfort. They're simple wooden platforms with no backs, no cushions, and no ergonomic considerations whatsoever. Sitting on one for 12 hours is like being slowly tortured, and the scribes develop pressure sores and circulation problems that never heal properly. Brother Aldrich has lost feeling in parts of his legs from sitting on these stools day after day, and he sometimes has to support himself with his hands when he stands because his legs won't hold his weight. But the real horror begins when he tries to actually write something. Medieval parchment isn't the smooth white paper you're used to seeing. It's made from animal skin that's been scraped and stretched and treated with chemicals that leave it rough, uneven, and unpredictable. Some areas are so thick that the quill pen can't penetrate properly, creating gaps and scratches in the letters. Other areas are so thin that the pen goes right through, ruining hours of work in an instant. The parchment is also incredibly expensive, costing more than most people make in months, so wasting any of it is a serious offence that can result in punishment, reduction in food rations, or even expulsion from the monastery. This creates a constant state of anxiety for the scribes, who know that a single mistake could have serious consequences, but are working under conditions that make mistakes almost inevitable. Preparing the parchment is itself a process that would disgust most modern people. It starts with animal skins, usually from sheep or goats, that have to be soaked in lime water to remove the hair and flesh. The skins are then stretched on frames and scraped with sharp knives to remove any remaining tissue and to create a smooth writing surface. The smell during this process is indescribable, a combination of rotting flesh, chemical treatments, and animal waste that would make most people vomit. The finished parchment retains some of this smell, especially in damp weather, so the scriptorium always has an underlying odour of death and decay that mingles with the smoke from candles and the unwashed bodies of the scribes. Brother Aldrich has worked in this environment for so long that he doesn't notice the smell anymore, but visitors to the scriptorium often have to leave quickly because the odour is so overwhelming. The writing implements are equally primitive and frustrating. The quill pens are made from goose feathers that have to be carefully prepared and sharpened, and they last only a few hours before they become too dull or damaged to use. Sharpening a quill pen is an art form that takes years to master, and even then the results are unpredictable. Some quills write smoothly and produce clean, even lines. Others scratch and skip and leave blots of ink that ruin the page. Brother Aldrich has to prepare his own quills, cutting and shaping them with a small knife that's so worn from use that it barely holds an edge. The process of preparing a single quill can take 20 minutes, and he goes through dozens of them in a day, so a significant portion of his time is spent on tool maintenance rather than actual writing. He's developed calluses and scars on his fingers from the constant handling of sharp knives and rough quills, and his hands are permanently stained with ink that never completely washes out. The ink itself is another source of frustration and expense. Medieval ink is made from a mixture of iron gall, water, and various binding agents, and it has to be prepared fresh regularly because it spoils quickly. The process of making ink is time-consuming and requires ingredients that are expensive and difficult to obtain. The iron gall comes from oak trees that have been attacked by wasps, creating small growths that have to be harvested, ground up, and mixed with other ingredients. The resulting ink is unpredictable in quality and behaviour. Sometimes it flows smoothly from the quill, allowing for clean, precise lettering. Other times it's too thick or too thin, creating smudges, blots, or lines that are barely visible. In cold weather, the ink can freeze in the inkwell, making it impossible to use. In hot weather, it can dry out or separate, creating a consistency that's impossible to work with. Brother Aldrich spends the first hour of each day preparing his materials, sharpening quills, mixing ink, arranging parchment, and setting up his workspace. This preparation time is unpaid and unrecognized, but it's essential for the work that follows. If he doesn't prepare properly, he'll waste time and materials during the day, which could result in punishment or loss of privileges. Once he finally begins writing, the real torture begins. Medieval manuscripts are written in scripts that require absolute precision and consistency. Every letter must be perfectly formed, every line must be straight, every word must be properly spaced. There are no erasers, no correction fluid, no delete keys. A mistake means starting over, and starting over means wasting parchment that costs more than most people make in a year. The Latin texts that Brother Aldrich copies are often works that he doesn't fully understand. He's learned to read Latin, but the theological and philosophical concepts in many of the manuscripts are beyond his education and experience. He's essentially copying symbols without understanding their meaning, like a machine that reproduces patterns without comprehending their significance. This lack of understanding makes the work even more tedious and mind-numbing. He can't take intellectual interest in what he's copying because he doesn't understand it, and he can't work quickly because he has to be careful not to make mistakes. So he spends 12 hours a day copying words that might as well be meaningless symbols, focused entirely on the mechanical process of forming letters, rather than on any intellectual or spiritual content. The physical toll of this work is devastating. After just a few hours of hunching over his desk, Brother Aldrich's neck and shoulders are in constant pain. His right hand, which holds the quill, develops cramps that are so severe he sometimes can't move his fingers. His eyes water and burn from the strain of focusing on small details in poor light, and he frequently gets headaches that can last for days. The eye strain is particularly serious because medieval scribes don't have access to corrective lenses. If Brother Aldrich's vision deteriorates, which it inevitably will from years of close work in poor light, there's no way to correct it. Many scribes become functionally blind by middle age, at which point they're no longer useful to the monastery and are relegated to other duties, or simply left to fend for themselves. The poor lighting conditions make the eye strain even worse. Candles produce a flickering, uneven light that constantly changes intensity and direction. The scribes have to position their candles carefully to avoid shadows on their work, but the slightest movement of the flame can create new shadows or change the apparent colour of the ink. Brother Aldrich has learned to work with his face inches from the parchment, but this creates additional strain on his neck and makes him even more susceptible to eye problems. In winter, when daylight is limited and expensive candles are rationed even more strictly, the scribes often work in near darkness. Brother Aldrich has learned to write by feel as much as by sight, using his fingertips to guide the quill and relying on muscle memory to form letters. This technique works for simple copying, but it makes it impossible to catch errors or to produce work of the highest quality. The cold in the scriptorium is another constant source of misery. Stone buildings are impossible to heat effectively with medieval technology, and the scriptorium is designed more for defense than comfort. Even with braziers burning charcoal, the temperature in winter rarely rises above freezing. Brother Aldrich wears multiple layers of robes and wraps his feet in rags, but he still spends most of the winter months shivering. The cold affects his work in ways that would challenge any modern office worker. His fingers become stiff and clumsy, making it difficult to grip the quill properly. The ink thickens in cold weather, making it harder to write smoothly. The parchment becomes brittle and can crack if handled roughly. Brother Aldrich has learned to warm his hands over a candle flame between paragraphs, but this is time-consuming and uses up precious candle wax. The social isolation of scribal work would be devastating for anyone used to modern workplace interaction. Brother Aldrich works alone for most of the day, with no conversation, no collaboration, and no social support. The monastery's rules forbid talking during work hours, so even when other scribes are present, they work in complete silence. The only sounds are the scratching of quills on parchment, the occasional turning of a page, and the constant background noise of men coughing, sniffling, and trying to suppress groans of pain. This isolation is particularly difficult because Brother Aldrich is copying works that are meant to be shared and discussed. He's preserving theological treatises, philosophical arguments, and historical accounts that are designed to be read by communities of scholars. But he works alone and in silence, unable to discuss or debate the ideas he's copying. The intellectual content of his work is completely divorced from his daily experience. The loneliness is compounded by the fact that Brother Aldrich has no prospect of advancement or change. He will spend the rest of his life copying manuscripts, and he will die at his desk, probably before he reaches old age, having spent decades in isolation and discomfort. There's no retirement, no vacation, no career development, no hope of improving his situation. This is his life until death provides the only escape. The economic aspects of scribal work would also shock modern people. Brother Aldrich produces works that are incredibly valuable, manuscripts that will be treasured by collectors and institutions for centuries, but he receives no compensation beyond basic food and shelter. He creates wealth but doesn't benefit from it, working under conditions that would violate every modern labor law while producing products that will outlast him by hundreds of years. The manuscripts he copies are so valuable that they're often chained to reading desks to prevent theft. But Brother Aldrich lives in poverty, wearing the same robes for years, eating the same meager meals, sleeping on the same straw pallet. He's creating some of the most precious objects in medieval society, but he's treated as barely more than a machine for reproducing text. The pressure to avoid mistakes creates a constant state of anxiety that affects every aspect of Brother Aldrich's work. He knows that a single error can ruin a page that took days to complete, wasting materials that cost more than most people make in months. This knowledge makes him second-guess every letter, every word, every line, creating a level of stress that would be considered pathological in modern terms. The anxiety is made worse by the fact that many of the texts he's copying are religious works, where accuracy is considered essential for salvation. A mistake in copying scripture or theological treatises isn't just an error, it's a potential sin that could affect the souls of future readers. Brother Aldrich carries the weight of spiritual responsibility along with the practical pressure to avoid wasting expensive materials. The copying process itself is monotonous to a degree that would challenge anyone's sanity. Brother Aldrich might spend weeks copying the same type of text, reproducing the same Latin phrases over and over again until they lose all meaning. He develops a kind of mental numbness that allows him to work without thinking, but this numbness also makes him more prone to errors and less able to catch mistakes when they occur. The repetitive nature of the work creates physical problems beyond the obvious issues with posture and eye strain. Brother Aldrich develops repetitive stress injuries in his hands and wrists that cause constant pain and limit his mobility. His fingers become permanently curved from gripping quills, and he loses the ability to fully extend his hand. These injuries make the work even more difficult and painful, but there's no treatment available and no option to stop working. The seasonal variations in working conditions would also be shocking to anyone used to modern climate control. In summer, the scriptorium becomes unbearably hot, with temperatures that make it difficult to concentrate and sweat that can drip onto the parchment and ruin hours of work. Brother Aldrich has to be constantly aware of his body position to avoid contaminating his work with perspiration and he often has to stop working entirely during the hottest parts of the day. In winter, the extreme cold makes it almost impossible to write. Brother Aldrich's fingers become so stiff that he can barely hold a quill, and the ink can freeze solid in the inkwell. He learns to work in short bursts, warming his hands between paragraphs, but this makes the already slow process even slower. Some days when the temperature drops below a certain point, it becomes impossible to work at all, and these lost days have to be made up later, extending the already long working hours. The diet provided to monastery scribes would be inadequate by any modern standard, but it's particularly problematic for men doing detailed intellectual work. Brother Aldrich's meals consist mainly of thin porridge, hard bread, and occasional vegetables, providing barely enough calories to sustain life, and certainly not enough to support the mental energy required for complex copying work. He frequently experiences episodes of dizziness, confusion, and inability to concentrate that are directly related to malnutrition. The lack of adequate nutrition affects his work in ways that create a vicious cycle of poor performance and increased stress. When he's hungry, he makes more mistakes, which increases his anxiety about wasting materials, which makes him even more prone to errors. He's often so focused on fighting off hunger pangs that he can't concentrate on the text he's copying, leading to mistakes that he wouldn't make under better conditions. The health problems that develop from years of scribal work would be considered occupational hazards that require immediate intervention by modern standards. Brother Aldrich has developed chronic back pain that never goes away, eye problems that make it increasingly difficult to see fine details, and hand injuries that make writing painful and difficult, but there's no medical care available, no ergonomic equipment, no workplace safety regulations. Instead, these health problems are considered normal aspects of the job, signs of dedication and sacrifice rather than symptoms of poor working conditions. Brother Aldrich is expected to work through pain and disability, and complaining about his condition is considered a sign of spiritual weakness rather than a legitimate workplace concern. The psychological effects of 15 years of this work have been devastating in ways that Brother Aldrich doesn't fully understand. He's developed what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. He has trouble sleeping, partly because of physical pain, but also because of intrusive thoughts about work, mistakes he's made, and the endless repetition of copying tasks. He's lost the ability to find pleasure in activities that used to bring him joy. Reading, which was once a source of intellectual stimulation, has become associated with work and no longer provides any satisfaction. He can't look at written text without automatically analyzing the quality of the lettering, the consistency of the spacing, and the potential for errors. The isolation has also affected his social skills and emotional development. After 15 years of working alone in silence, Brother Aldrich has difficulty carrying on conversations, relating to other people, or expressing his thoughts and feelings. He's become so accustomed to internal dialogue and mental processing that external communication feels foreign and uncomfortable. Perhaps most tragically, Brother Aldrich has lost touch with the intellectual and spiritual content of the work he's doing. He's copying some of the most important theological and philosophical works of his time, but he's so focused on the mechanical process of reproduction that he's unable to engage with the ideas. He's become a human printing press, reproducing text without understanding or appreciating its significance. The manuscripts he creates will survive for centuries, influencing scholars and thinkers long after he's dead, but he derives no satisfaction from this legacy, because he's never allowed to step back and appreciate the broader significance of his work. He's too busy focusing on individual letters to see the ideas they form, too concerned with avoiding mistakes to contemplate the meaning of what he's copying. So when you imagine the life of a medieval scribe, don't think about scholarly monks in comfortable libraries, surrounded by beautiful books and engaged in intellectual pursuits. Think about Brother Aldrich, hunched over his desk in a cold, dark room, slowly going blind and developing permanent disabilities while copying texts he doesn't understand, isolated from human contact and intellectual engagement, creating beautiful and important works while destroying himself in the process. That's the reality of medieval scribal work, not a romantic pursuit of knowledge and beauty, but a form of intellectual slave labor that consumed the bodies and minds of the men who preserved the written heritage of medieval civilization, leaving behind magnificent manuscripts and broken human beings, creating art that would last forever while destroying the artists who made it possible.